This is the screencast for Lesson 34 of Stephen's C# 24-hour trainer. The focus of this lesson is localizing applications. So for this try it, we're going to localize a small test application. Here's the program so far. Right now it's just got a bunch of radio buttons and that's about it. It doesn't do anything. Most of localization, at least in the user interface, occurs right here in the form designer. So to get started, click on the form, go over to the properties window and find the localizable property. Right there. Change that to true. That will allow you to localize the form. Then in the language property, open this drop down and you can see a huge list of languages or of locales you can pick. The property is called language. These actually are locales, so they do more than just the language itself. And you'll notice they come in families. For example, here are a whole bunch of different Spanish versions. If the user has one of these, for example, Colombia is their locale, but you have not localized your application for Colombia, it will drop back to the generic Spanish setting if it can. And if that doesn't work, it'll go all the way back to the default setting, which is what you used to originally build the user interface in. We're going to pick Spanish Mexico. So now all we need to do is change properties on this form so that they match what we want to see in Mexico. And I'll just type a few in here for the form's caption. I'll type this. CCIONE. And I'll do some, well, let's see. Now if you notice, in a lot of languages, the length of the text you need to use to convey the same information changes. For example, this is much longer than the American version foreground color. Sometimes you may need to resize controls and rearrange them to make everything fit in the new language. Let's give some color names here. Okay, yep, spelled wrong. That's a little better. All right, and you can do the background colors in a similar fashion. They're pretty simple. So now the next thing I want to look at is how do we deal with the user clicking on these buttons. The hint in the text said that we should be able to use one event handler for all of these buttons and another event handler for these buttons. So let's look at these first. I'm going to click on that red button, come over to the Events tab, and I want to give it a click event handler. I'm going to change its name because right now it says FG red radio button. That's because this was the FG red radio button. I want to change it, so I'm going to refactor, rename, and I'm going to make this just the FG radio button click event. So its name doesn't tie it to that red button because I'm going to use it for all of the background or all of the foreground buttons. Now in here, I need to assign the foreground color of the form, and to do that I need to figure out which button the user picked. There are a lot of different ways you could do this. The way I've decided to do it here is I'm going to get that button, figure out which button it was, use its tag property, and turn that into the color that I'm going to use. So first, let me take this sender object. That's the button that raised this event. I need to turn it into a radio button. So I'm going to say radio button, and I'll call it rad equals sender as radio button. So that will cast the sender thing into a radio button. Now I can use the radio button's properties, in particular its tag property. I want to get a color out of that, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, here's my color variable, I'll call it CLR equals color.fromName, and then I'm going to pass in the name of the color, which I store in this controls tag property. Now the tag property is an object. It could be anything. If you're setting it in the form designer back here, in fact, let me do that right now. There's that button. Go back to the Properties tab, come down here to Tag. I'll type in red. Okay. If I'm entering the value here, it's a string. But in general, the tag property could contain any sort of object. So to use it here, because the fromName method expects a string, I need to turn this thing back into a string. So I'll just call it toString method. So that'll take this tag and turn it back into the string that it really is. Finally, now I have my color, I can use it. So what I'm going to do is first I'll set the form's foreground color to be this color. And then also because certain controls don't inherit colors automatically when you change them on the form, I'm going to set the foreground group box. Oops, hang on. The group box's foreground color also to be this color, and the background group box, its forecolor is going to be this color. All right, so let's go back. I set one tag property. Let's set the others. This one should be, where's its tag property? Green, blue, white, black, and white. And you can do the same for the background colors. All right, so let's run the program and see what happens. Here it is, and it says select colors in English, foreground, and it's got all these colors in English. If I click on red, you notice all these colors changed to red. There's green didn't work because I didn't set the event handler. Let's go back and do that next, and then we'll talk about why those others didn't do, why it's not displaying Spanish. So I'm going to select all of these buttons all at the same time, go over here to the events, and under the click event, I'm going to select that FG radio button click. So now they're all using the same event handler. Let's try it again, make sure the colors at least work. Red, green, blue, black, and white, which is kind of hard to see. So that much is good. So the only remaining question is, why did we get English? Well, the reason is I'm running on an American English computer here, so because it's not localized for that version, it drops back to the default localization for this form, which is what you get if you come back up here and set this language to default, way up here at the top. All right, so that's the way I originally built this thing. That all makes sense. What we need to do is explicitly force this thing to choose the language I'm interested in. And there's code for that in the book. When I created the form, Visual Studio automatically made this constructor for me. Here's the call to initialize component that loads all of these values. So it's in front of that, before initialize component, that I need to select Spanish. And rather than retyping all of this by hand, let me see if I can find that code. Let's see, I believe it is in here. Right there. Okay, so here's an example. This code will select either English or Spanish, depending on which code you leave commented out. So right now I've got these lines commented out. They would force this to be US English, and I have these lines not commented out. They're the ones that force it to be Spanish. I'm getting squiggly underlines because thread and culture aren't defined. Let me go back in here again and get my using directives from the top. I need to have using.threading, system.threading, and system.globalization to use those two. The globalization gets me the culture info, and then system.threading gets me the thread. So now let me run it again. When the form is created, its constructor is going to select this ES-MX, Spanish in Mexico, locale. Then it'll call initialize component. At that point, it'll go off into the resource files associated with this project and pull up my localized version for Spanish. And there it is. We've got our Spanish names over here.